April 4, 1945. The sky at 24,000 feet was clear and freezing. A young B-24 Liberator pilot with the 448th Bomb Group gripped his plane's yoke with numb fingers, the monotonous drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines filling the cabin. This was his 31st mission, a hell he had grown accustomed to. Around them, P-51 Mustang fighters buzzed like silver guardian angels, while below, enemy territory stretched out like a patchwork quilt. When the call, "Bandits in the area," crackled over the radio, everyone expected the usual Focke-Wulfs, or the stubborn Messerschmitt 109s. But what happened next defied the laws of physics, their experience, and even their worst nightmares. Before the screams came over the radio, the pilot saw something in the corner of his eye. Not a propeller. A ghost. A silver streak. It passed under their formation with incomprehensible speed, as if they were suspended motionless in the air. The gunner's .50 caliber machine guns desperately hammered the empty space behind it. The tracers fell away helplessly, chasing a target they could never reach.
The pilot snapped his head around in shock, only to see 2 B-24s, which had been flying like a steel wall beside him, now falling out of formation. One, the Red Bow, was descending with flames erupting from its wing. The other was misbehaving, the plane of one of his closest friends. Before his very eyes, the massive airframe of the Red Bow was torn in two by the impact of 30-millimeter cannon shells, as if struck by a giant's axe. In that moment, he understood. This was a new weapon. This was a killer from the future. This was the Messerschmitt Me 262, and it was flying into the Allies' worst nightmares. This is the story of the world's first operational jet fighter, the tragic tale of a technological marvel so revolutionary it could have changed the course of the war, yet was brought down by the mistakes of its own creators and the brutal realities of combat. This is the story of the Schwalbe, the swallow that flew into the sky ahead of its time only to be defeated by the war of yesterday. The origins of the Me 262 date back to early 1939, long before the storm clouds of war broke over Europe. In those years, the Luftwaffe High Command, led by Hermann Göring, believed they could easily win any conflict with their existing piston-engine aircraft. Radical projects like jet technology were therefore given low priority, even seen as unnecessary. But William Messerschmitt, the genius of his namesake company, and his project leader Woldemar Voigt knew that piston engines and propellers were reaching their technological limits. The future lay in the revolutionary technology developed by Hans von Ohain, the jet engine. When the Reich Air Ministry requested an aircraft capable of at least 850 kilometers per hour and an endurance of 1 hour, work began quietly under the code name Project 1065. On paper, it was a masterpiece. The fuselage, designed by aerodynamicist Ludwig Bolquo, had the grace of a bird of prey. But its most revolutionary feature was its wings. As proposed by aerodynamic genius Adolf Bussmann back in 1935, the wings were swept back at an angle of 18.5 degrees. At the time, this was a practical necessity, a solution to correctly position the center of gravity with the heavy jet engines. But this coincidental decision would grant the Me 262 an incredible advantage by delaying the onset of shock waves at high speeds as it approached the sound barrier, pioneering a new age in aviation. The first prototypes took to the air on April 18, 1941. But there was a problem. The jet engines were still not ready. So, a conventional Junkers UMO 210 piston engine was mounted on the nose for testing. It was a strange hybrid, a new body being tested with old technology. When the jet engines were finally installed, the first flights nearly ended in disaster. The tailwheel landing gear of the early prototypes prevented the jet exhaust from lifting the tail off the ground. On his second attempt, test pilot Fritz Wendell came up with an ingenious solution. Upon reaching takeoff speed, he tapped the brakes, which pitched the aircraft's nose down and lifted the tail, giving him control. On July 18, 1942, he made a historic flight purely on jet power. Months before Britain's Gloucester meteor, the jet age had officially begun.
However, there is a vast chasm between drawing a dream and mass-producing it. The project's Achilles heel was clear from the start: the engines. The Junkers UMO 004 axial flow jet engines were a technology far beyond their time. Unlike the simpler centrifugal flow engines developed by Britain's Frank Whittle, the German axial flow design was slimmer, more aerodynamic, and theoretically much more powerful. But it was also incredibly complex and fragile. This technology demanded special metals capable of withstanding incredible temperatures and pressures: nickel, cobalt, chromium. These were the metals that formed the superalloys, allowing the turbine blades in the heart of the engine to spin without melting, bending, or disintegrating. And as the war progressed, these metals became more precious than gold to Germany. Allied bombing raids on centers like Schweinfurt and the loss of resource regions like Finland all but cut off Germany's access to these vital materials. Faced with a shortage of raw materials, German engineers had to attempt the impossible. They replaced the high-temperature components with lower-quality materials, such as regular steel coated in aluminum. The result was a catastrophe. The average lifespan of a JUMO 004 engine was a mere 10 to 25 hours. For comparison, a Rolls-Royce Merlin piston engine could last for hundreds of hours. This wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was a deadly gamble for the pilots. Every mission was a game of Russian roulette, never knowing when the engines would give out. Pilots flew with one eye on the enemy in the sky and the other glued to the engine temperature gauges in the cockpit. As the legendary German ace Günter Rahl described his first test flight, the thing that surprised me most was the silence. In a piston engine aircraft, you have a hell of a lot of noise and vibration. I didn't experience that in the Me-262. The sound was totally clear. But you had to advance the throttles very slowly. If you went forward too fast, you might overheat and set the engines on fire. This meant that pilots were constantly on edge. The Me-262 was a delicate, lethal monster that consumed its own power.
Despite all these difficulties, the aircraft was beyond expectations. Legendary pilots like Fighter General Adolf Galland, after testing the plane, said, "It was as if an angel were pushing you." They pleaded for it to be put into immediate mass production, to be used as a fighter. They knew this was the only weapon that could annihilate the Allied bomber fleets that were leveling Germany day and night. But then, a nightmare descended upon the project. That nightmare was named Adolf Hitler. In mid-1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler's mentality had shifted. He was focused less on defense and more on revenge. He had become obsessed with new Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. Like the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the Me-262 was to be a weapon of reprisal in his eyes. In a smoke-filled room in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, he angrily ordered his generals, "This is not a fighter. This will be a Blitzbomber, a lightning bomber." Hitler envisioned the Me-262 as an unstoppable weapon that would bomb the enemy lines during the expected Allied invasion of France. In his mind, the aircraft's speed would make it completely immune to Allied fighters. This decision was not just a mistake, it was a strategic catastrophe. The aircraft had to be redesigned to become a bomber, with bomb sights and under-fuselage pylons for bombs. These additions ruined the plane's sleek aerodynamics, reducing its speed and maneuverability. Most importantly, this decision meant the loss of precious months, more than a year of critical time. At the most crucial moment of the war, a weapon that could have owned the sky was kept grounded by the hubris and strategic blindness of one man. When the Me-262 finally entered service in mid-1944, it was too late and in numbers that were far too small. It entered the battlefield as both the Schwalbe, swallow, fighter, and Hitler's desired Sturmvogel, stormbird, fighter-bomber. And yes, it was incredible. It could reach speeds of 900 kilometers per hour, 150 kilometers per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, the fastest Allied fighter. With its four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, it could obliterate a B-17 with just a few hits. The cannons were nicknamed the pneumatic hammer for their slow rate of fire, but when they hit, they could shatter a bomber's structure. Allied pilots reported seeing aircraft disintegrate like metal confetti. A special night fighter version was even developed. The two-seat Me-262B1AU-1 carried the FUG-218 Neptune radar with its Hirschgewehr, stag antennas on the nose. These aircraft became the terror of the fast British mosquito bombers over the skies of Berlin. However, flying this machine was an art in itself. The two-seat trainer was so rare that many German pilots had to make their first jet flight in a single-seat aircraft, completely alone. This was an unbelievable risk. And its speed was also its curse. As the legendary German ace Johannes Steinhoff said, the Allied fighters were like a sack of fleas. The Me-262 was a missile at high speed, but it was sluggish in low-speed turns. If you turned too sharply, those precious engines could flame out. As pilot Walter Krapinski noted, we had lost our maneuverability. Speed was our life insurance. This speed also made aiming nearly impossible. Krapinski explained, "You had very little time to pick your target. You had to be right the first time. You approached fast, fired a short burst, and then you left."
After the initial shock, the Allies adapted cleverly. Instead of trying to dogfight this monster in the air, they decided to hunt it in its lair. They quickly discovered the Me-262's moments of greatest weakness: takeoff and landing. The jet engines were slow to accelerate, and during these moments the aircraft was sluggish and vulnerable. Allied pilots, seeing the distinctive black exhaust smoke of the kerosene burners on their radios, began to lie in wait over Me-262 bases like hawks circling a nest. The pilots of the British 135th Wing, flying Hawker Tempests, called this tactic the rat scramble. When an Me-262 was reported airborne, instead of trying to fight it, they would fly directly to its base and attack the jets as they were slowing down to land, low on fuel and defenseless. The famous American pilot Chuck Yeager scored his first Me-262 victory by catching a jet on its landing approach. Other aces, like Hubert Zemke, used the same tactic to deadly effect. On February 25, 1945, Mustangs from the 55th Fighter Group caught an entire squadron of Me-262s during takeoff and destroyed 6 jets on the ground. The Germans tried desperately to respond. They established flock alleys around their bases, corridors of death made up of over 150 quad 20mm anti-aircraft batteries. They also assigned their best propeller fighters, like the FW-190D, with red and white stripes painted on their undersides, to provide protection for the jets. But it was a desperate effort against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. By the beginning of 1945, the war was lost for Germany. The Luftwaffe's high command was shattered by failure and political infighting. In the midst of this chaos, a legend was reborn from the ashes. General of fighters Adolf Galland had been dismissed by Hitler for his constant criticism of Luftwaffe's strategy and Göring's leadership. He was disgraced, pushed aside, but he was given one last chance. Göring mockingly told him he could form his own unit. Galland seized the opportunity. In February 1945, he formed one of the most elite and most tragic fighter units in history, Jagdverband 44. This was no ordinary squadron. This was the squadron of experts. Galland gathered the best, most experienced, and most highly decorated pilots from across the Reich, men who had been grounded by the crippling fuel shortage. Johannes Steinhoff, Walter Krupinski, Günther Lutzow, Heinrich Baer. Each name was a legend in itself. Together, they were a constellation of Knight's Cross holders. Their mission was simple: to fly the Me-262 as it was always meant to be flown, as a pure bomber-destroyer, and prove the true potential of this magnificent aircraft. Based at Munich-Riem Airfield, Jagdverband 44 was the last bastion of desperate genius. But the Allied rat-scramble tactic was their greatest threat. They had to protect their priceless jets and their even more priceless pilots during their most vulnerable moments. Galland devised an ingenious solution. He formed the Papageienstaffel, the Parrot Squadron. These were high-performance Focke-Wulf FW-190D fighters, their undersides painted with bright red and white stripes. These vivid colors allowed German anti-aircraft gunners to distinguish them from Allied aircraft. The Parrot Squadron had one single duty: to fly a protective shield over the Me-262s as they took off and landed. In its short life, Jagdverband 44 achieved incredible success, but the price was staggering. On April 18th, one of the squadron's key commanders, Johannes Steinhoff, suffered a horrific crash when his landing gear failed on takeoff. He barely escaped the burning wreck, but suffered severe burns that would scar him for the rest of his life. Just 6 days later, another legend, Günther Lutzow, an ace with over 110 victories, failed to return after attacking a bomber formation. His plane and his body were never found. He vanished forever, somewhere over the Alps. On April 26th, the commander himself, Adolf Galland, was ambushed by escorting P-47 Thunderbolts after shooting down a B-26 Marauder bomber bump. His jet was riddled with bullets, and he was wounded in the knee. He barely managed to crash land back at his base. It was his final combat mission. The story of Jagdverband 44 was the perfect summary of the Me-262's fate: brilliance, defiance, and ultimate tragic failure.
As 1944 came to a close, with Allied armies pressing in on all fronts, the German High Command decided to risk everything on one final, desperate gamble in the West. This gamble was known as the Battle of the Bulge, and to support this massive ground offensive, the Luftwaffe planned its own surprise attack, an audacious all-or-nothing assault designed to cripple Allied air power in a single blow. This was Operation Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate. The plan was daring in its simplicity. On New Year's Day, 1945, nearly 1,000 German aircraft, virtually all that was left of the Luftwaffe's fighting strength in the West, would take off in absolute secrecy and strike Allied airfields across Holland, Belgium, and France at dawn. The Me-262, the Reich's most advanced weapon, had a critical role to play. While most of the force consisted of FW-198s and Bf-109s, the jet fighter bombers of Kampfgeschwader 51 were tasked with precision strikes against key airfields like Eindhoven and Hisch. Their incredible speed was supposed to allow them to hit their targets and escape before the Allies could even react. In the frozen pre-dawn darkness of January 1st, the operation began. It was a chaotic symphony of desperation. Inexperienced young pilots, some with only a few hours of flight time, tried to navigate in strict radio silence to maintain surprise. Fuel was so scarce that many planes only had enough for a one-way trip. The attack achieved total surprise. Allied pilots sleeping off New Year's Eve celebrations awoke to the sound of roaring engines and exploding aircraft. German fighters swept low over the airfields, strafing rows of parked Spitfires, Typhoons, and Thunderbolts. On the ground, Operation Bodenplatte was a tactical success. The Luftwaffe destroyed or damaged hundreds of Allied aircraft. But this success came at a price that Germany could no longer afford to pay. The cost was not in machines, it was in men. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 pilots that day, many of them irreplaceable veteran instructors and squadron leaders who were needed to train the next generation. The Allies, shocked and battered, lost many planes, but very few pilots, as most were not in their aircraft when the attack came. For the Me-262 units, the results were symbolic of the entire operation. They flew their missions, but suffered losses they could not replace. Their technological advantage could not overcome the fatal flaws of the plan: poor navigation by inexperienced pilots, friendly fire from German anti-aircraft gunners who weren't informed of the attack, and the simple fact that destroying parked planes did not win a war of attrition. The Allies could replace their aircraft in a matter of weeks. Their factories were churning out thousands of planes a month. Germany could never replace its pilots. Operation Bodenplatte was the Luftwaffe's death blow, a Pyrrhic victory that shattered its remaining strength. The comet had burned brightly for one last spectacular moment, and then extinguished forever.
In the final months of the war, the Me-262 units that remained continued to focus on their true mission: destroying bombers. German engineers developed a new tactic: the R-4M rockets. 12 of these unguided rockets were mounted under each wing, allowing the Me-262s to fire a devastating salvo from outside the defensive range of the bomber's machine guns, spreading like a shotgun blast. A single rocket hit was often enough to bring down a B-17. On March 18, 1945, 37 Me-262s from JG-7 attacked a massive Allied armada of 1,221 bombers and 632 escort fighters with these rockets. They shot down 12 bombers and 1 fighter for the loss of only 3 jets, a 4-to-1 ratio. On paper, a brilliant victory. But in reality, they had only affected 1% of the attacking force. It was a drop in the ocean. March 30, 1945, Good Friday. Only 20 Me-262s could take off to oppose a fleet of 1,400 bombers attacking Hamburg. It wasn't a mission, it was suicide. One of the 14 jet pilots shot down that day was Lieutenant Erich Schult. After bailing out from his crippled plane, he was found by a farmer's family. His last words were, "The engines didn't want to go anymore. They were behind me. Somehow they got me. I was hanging in the parachute. Then they shot at me." He bled to death minutes later. The Me-262 could win a duel, but it could never win the war. Germany's industrial infrastructure had collapsed. Fuel shortages kept the planes on the ground. The most experienced pilots were gone. Production was moved to hidden underground factories and forests, and even to vast tunnels like Berg Kristall in Austria, built by the slave labor of concentration camp prisoners. In these tunnels, tens of thousands of people perished under horrific conditions, where the average life expectancy was 6 months, all to build the Me-262. But these efforts could not stop the Allied flood of production. When the war ended, about 1,400 Me-262s had been produced, but the number ready for combat at any one time was less than 100.
The weapon of the future had lost the war of today. The captured Me-262s were scrambled for like treasure in massive operations. The legendary British test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, who flew the aircraft, called it the most formidable aircraft of World War II. He said, "This was a blitzkrieg aircraft. It was designed to strike and destroy bombers. It was never meant to be a dogfighter." Brown noted that, in terms of performance, it was a quantum leap ahead of all other aircraft of the time, praising its sensitive controls and stable gun platform, while also criticizing its slow acceleration and delicate engines. The revolutionary design of the Me-262, its swept wings and its axial-flow jet engines, changed the course of aviation history forever. The first legendary jets of the post-war era, the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, were directly inspired by the Me-262's design. In particular, the automatic leading-edge slats on the Sabre's wings, which improved lift during low-speed turns, were a direct copy of the Me-262's design. The enemy of yesterday had become the teacher of the new generation. The story of the Messerschmitt Me-262 is the most poignant proof that technology alone cannot win a war. It was a diamond that flashed for a moment in the sky, brilliant, flawless, yet fragile. A victory of engineering genius, but a victim of strategic blindness, a lack of resources, and overwhelming numerical superiority. That propellerless ghost seen by Allied bomber pilots in the clear skies of 1945 was more than just an airplane. It was the future of aviation. But it was also a bitter symbol of a collapsing empire, and a solemn reminder that even wonder weapons cannot change the tide of destiny. The swallow had taken flight, but it could not bring the spring.